Hallöchen! This video covers the history of the city of Lemberg, or Lviv as most people would call it today, from the late 1860s to the end of the First World War. It is a direct sequel to the previous episode, which looks at the city's development between the First Polish Partition and the Austro-Hungarian Compromise. So it is advisable to watch that one first, even if it's not strictly necessary. In any case, I'll just give you a short recap of the most important things covered in that video, so that we're all on the same page. Almost immediately after the Austrian takeover in the late 18th century, Emperor Joseph II issued a number of reforms in Galicia. These reforms severely weakened the traditionally predominant local Polish nobility and transferred most of the power to the central government in Vienna. The Austrians also got to work on transforming the decaying city of Lemberg into a modern, clean and spacious German-style city. The project of turning Lemberg into a sort of Vienna of the East by building wide and green promenades surrounded with Biedermeier-style houses alongside impressive representative buildings was only partially successful, and the city would still remain one of the poorest in the Austrian Empire. What made Lemberg so special was its multi-ethnic population, the majority of whom were Polish speakers, followed by a significant number of Jews and Ukrainians. This was a time before widespread nationalism, so the coexistence was largely peaceful and Austrian rule was not seriously challenged. This can be explained by the fact that the Austrian authorities were willing to grant the various ethnicities small concessions. For example, they financially supported the construction of the Ossolineum, a centre for Polish culture and learning. What we can also observe is that this was a time where a distinct Ukrainian nationality began to emerge, something which the Austrians also supported. And finally, the mostly Orthodox Jewish population also saw a small trend towards acculturation and assimilation in the hopes of finally leaving the dreadful living conditions in the ghetto. After a number of catastrophic military defeats, the Austrians were forced to grant autonomy to Galicia, and Lemberg was able to largely govern itself. These reforms, alongside the unfair election system, largely benefited the wealthy and educated Polish aristocrats and landowners who quickly took control over the regional and city councils. From that point on, the Germanized city of Lemberg would gain a Polish character once again and would change significantly. But before we talk about the so-called Polonisation of Lemberg, let's just quickly take a look at the circumstances that led to the compromise between the Habsburg monarchy and the Poles in Galicia. After Austria's defeat in the Second Italian War of Unification in 1859, the experiment of a neo-absolutist system came to a dramatic end and was instead replaced by a constitutionalist and federalist way of rule. When Agenoa Gołuchowski, a Galician by birth, became the interior minister of Austria, the question of how to deal with the Poles became relevant once again. The Galician Poles themselves were very eager to find a reasonable compromise with the Austrians. After an uprising in Russian Poland had been crushed in 1863, a new form of conservatism emerged. Many Galician politicians began to argue that armed uprisings were not an effective way to gain independence for Poland, and that they should be condemned. Instead, the Poles should ensure their national existence by cooperating with the comparatively lenient Austrians. For instance, the politician and publicist Stanisław Koźmian argued that although independence was the most perfect form of national existence, it was not the only one. The Galician conservatives argued that only complete loyalty to the Habsburg Empire could ensure that Galicia and Lemberg could keep their Polish character. In 1866, the Galician Diet submitted an address in which they proclaimed their loyalty to His Imperial Majesty. The introduction of Galician autonomy and self-rule for Lemberg was an arrangement that both sides could live with. The Austrians now had the Poles on their side and wouldn't have to worry about Polish resistance, while the Polish politicians in Lemberg could do pretty much whatever they wanted. The very first step, of course, was the introduction of Polish as the sole official language in Lemberg instead of German, which had been predominant in education and administration until the 1860s. There was some protest against this measure by the Ruthenian members of the city council, such as Josip Lozinski, who argued, to deprive the capital of Lemberg of the Ruthenian language would be to violate the rights of the people of Ruthenia, and nothing that was acquired through the harm of others is permanent and will be avenged. Lemberg is the capital, the centre, the heart of Ruthenia, and if someone strikes against it with the blow of Polonisation, he will violate the heart of the entire Ruthenian people. The Polish parliamentarian and lawyer Michał Gnoiński disagreed and argued against the introduction of a second official language. A bilingual administration would make administrative manipulation extremely difficult, cause inevitable confusion and increase costs, without the slightest benefit or necessity, since the ministry's rescript of 1860 expressively provides that the municipalities may adopt as official any language they choose. While Gnoiński may have put forth a pragmatic argument against the legal equality of Ruthenian alongside Polish, the real reason behind this was far more self-centered. The Poles in the city council had gained the right to rule, and they were not going to share it. This also becomes abundantly clear in the very quick pace at which the city got Polonized. The city council realized the political potential that city names held, for instance, and how they could convey the importance of people, events, or achievements of a certain nation. Some street names were simply translated. Theaterstraße became Ulica Teatralna, and Krakauer Straße became Ulica Krakowska. Other renamings were much more symbolic. Suddenly there was a Sobieski Street in honor of King John III, Sobieski, or a Mickiewicz Street in honor of the famous poet. As the city expanded in the late 19th century, the city council made sure that the new streets would all be somehow related to Polish culture and history. One street was named after the veterans of the failed Polish uprisings, another one was named after the Battle of Grunwald, while others commemorated famous writers such as Mikołaj Rej or Eliza Orzeszkowa. Street names that remembered the other ethnic groups in the city, such as the Ruthenians, Armenians or the Jews, were changed pretty much without exception. For example, Lwów, the Rurikid prince who made Lviv the capital of the Galician Volhynian Principality in the 13th century, was simply relegated to a small and shabby street in the northeast of the town. Another important aspect of giving Lemberg its Polish character back was obviously education. Like elsewhere in the Habsburg Empire, nationalists in Lemberg considered schools to be the most efficient way to make people identify themselves with a national community. They seemed to offer infinite opportunities to indoctrinate and raise the new generations according to the ideals of their respective nationality. And the new constitution of Austria fully gave up the principle of education in German and granted every pupil the right to be taught in their own mother tongue without having to learn another of the official languages. At least in theory. Because in Galicia, the school law stated that the right of determining the language used at schools was reserved to whomever maintained the school. And in Lemberg's case, that was the city of Lemberg itself. In the 1870s, the education system in the city was in a really bad shape. School usually took place in a rented, badly maintained room, and most schools were hopelessly crowded. So much in fact that many children couldn't even fulfill their school obligation. To combat this, the city council invested heavily into the construction of modern, clean and functional school buildings, and even went into debt for it. And it was a success. In 1880, there were only 15 city-run schools with roughly 5,500 pupils. In 1907, there were already 44 schools with more than 21,000 pupils. Still, the city struggled to keep up with the demand for schooling, and Lemberg had a remarkably low literacy rate, even among pupils who had actually gone to school. Nonetheless, the progress in the education system as a whole was impressive. The local literacy rate rose from roughly 50% in the mid-19th century to more than 80% in the 1910s. Of course, students in all of these city-run schools were taught in Polish, and the council purposefully established these new schools in areas with a significant Ruthenian population, in order to raise the new generation in a Polish way of life. Although the council issued a regulation that demanded the creation of a Ruthenian parallel class in schools with more than 40 Ruthenian pupils, these parallel classes were almost never created, because Lemberg's Ruthenians didn't live in separate quarters, but as a spread-out minority. As a consequence, there were almost never enough Ruthenian children at any school to justify such a parallel class. And even when they were created, the council still didn't let go of their policy of Polonisation. For instance, a teacher was hired who claimed to speak Ukrainian, but then only spoke Polish to his Ruthenian pupils and identified as a Pole. Lemberg's Ruthenian minority could only do little about it because they lacked the funds to maintain their own private schools. Furthermore, the council also did their best to prevent the founding of Ruthenian schools and skirted around the topic of Greek Catholic religion class, because in their eyes, any Ruthenian school could challenge the notion of a purely Polish Lemberg. The council member Franciszek Tomaszewski, for example, argued that during this period of increased national tensions, the use of Polish at schools was a need of the time in order not to threaten the national character of Lemberg. Another important institution that soon became Polonized was the university. Before the period of Galician autonomy, German had been used as the main teaching medium. Initially, both Polish and Ruthenian were granted equal status, but after increasing pressure from the local professoriate, a ministerial decree of 1882 declared that Polish was the language in which lectures should be taught. This made it possible for Polish professors from either Prussia or Russia to flock into the city and to turn Lemberg University into a bastion of Polish science, alongside the Jagiellonian University in Kraków. Talented historians such as Tadeusz Wojciechowski or Fryderyk Papé conducted valuable research about the history of Galicia and Ruthenia in general. Lemberg also became the home of Józef Supinski, the economist and sociologist who was one of the main advocates for the idea of Polish positivism, a movement which argued that Poland couldn't regain its independence with armed resistance, but rather by gradually educating the Polish population and by creating the foundations for an organized society. Lemberg University also contributed a lot in the fields of science. The physicist Marian Smoluchowski independently explained the Brownian motion, and Edmund Biernacki discovered the velocity of the descent of blood cells, the so-called Biernacki reaction. It is one of the oldest routinely used blood tests. Furthermore, Lemberg also became an important center of Polish culture, mostly centered around the new opera. By the 1890s, the Polish elite in the city attempted to show the world that they were part of the ruling nations, and on the same cultural level as the Germans or the Hungarians. The old Skarbek theatre, in which both German and Polish plays were held, was no longer sufficient, and so a new opera house had to be built, which was to be a clear expression of Polish pride and the Polish elite's control over Galicia. As the newspaper Gazeta Narodowa put it, a new theatre will be one more of the beautiful and lasting monuments of worth which the current city council is leaving for its successors. After the city had managed to gain the sufficient amount of capital, partially through fundraising, the architect Zygmunt Gorgolewski got to work. He chose to build the theatre right on top of the promenade west of the old town, which the Austrians had built in the early 1800s. In October 1900, it was finished, and it could easily have competed with theatre buildings in European capitals in terms of beauty and grandeur. The two statues to the left and to the right of the main entrance symbolized comedy and tragedy. The front gable was adorned with a classical relief, and towering above the roof were three impressive bronze statues: the Genius of Tragedy in the west, the Genius of Music in the east, and Gloria bearing a gold laurel in the middle. Inside, more than 1,100 people could be seated, and the ceiling was essentially a giant canvas with a beautiful painting on it. The first play that was played there was the opera Janek by Władysław Żeleński. The Theatre Commission made every effort to keep the artistic standard as high as possible, and to make sure that the Lemberg Theatre was the highest of all the Polish cultural institutions of that time. In a report written by the Commission, it says, "What is certain is that the Polish stage in the capital should serve above all Polish dramatic literature, and therefore has the primary obligation to perform original Polish works, so that it can bring the greatest benefit to domestic dramatic literature." As a result, only national pieces by Polish authors such as Adam Mickiewicz or Juliusz Słowacki were shown on Sunday afternoons, and the entry tickets were sold at a cheap price in the hopes of luring in as many people as possible. In the 1880s and 1890s, Lemberg also received its fair share of statues and monuments to remind its citizens of the glory of Poland's history and to further cement the Polish character. It should be noted that, like in many other cities at the time, the ideas for those statues were usually conceived by private bourgeois associations, such as the Development and Beautification Society. The city council usually just provided a free construction site and sent the mayor in order to hold a sentimental speech at the inauguration. As time went on, monuments were erected for the national poet Adam Mickiewicz, the commander of the Warsaw Uprising of 1794, Jan Kiliński, the author and father of Polish comedy Aleksander Fredro, the Galician governor and Austrian interior minister Ageno Gołuchowski, the Democrat and parliamentarian Franciszek Smolka, and many more. Of particular importance, however, was the monument dedicated to John III Sobieski, the King of Poland in the late 17th century, who showed great military skill, especially at the famous Battle of Vienna in 1683, in which he headed a relief force of Polish, Austrian and German troops and inflicted a crushing defeat on the Ottomans. Since then, John III Sobieski has often been glorified as a hero and as a savior of Christendom and European civilization. The monument to Sobieski in Lemberg served two purposes. For one, it obviously served as a memorialization of an important Polish historical figure, but it also served as an expression of loyalty to the Habsburg Empire. After all, it was he alone who, in the eyes of contemporary Polish nationalists, saved Vienna and the Habsburg dynasty from the Ottoman yoke. The monument was erected on the Ring Road in 1898, just a few hundred meters away from the Opera House. But how did Lemberg change architecturally during that time as a whole? Before the period of autonomy, urban construction had been closely monitored by the Austrian government, and most prominent designers came from Vienna. In the 1870s, however, Polish architects took over the most glamorous projects. It has to be said, however, that Lemberg's new architecture was pretty much devoid of any local or national characteristics and saw similar developments as all the other major cities in the Habsburg Empire. Most of these new architects were state-employed and had previously worked in the German Empire or in Vienna. As such, the Viennese Ringstraßenstil was found even in this city almost 600 kilometers away from the Austrian capital. For example, Julian Zachariewicz, who had studied in Vienna, modeled the main building of the Polytechnic School in Lemberg after the Viennese Technical College. Similarly, the architect Juliusz Hochberger, originally from Posen or Poznań in Prussia, also took inspiration from neo-Renaissance buildings in Vienna when he designed the new seat of the Galician Parliament in 1881. Also very notable are the wealthy quarters outside of the city centre, which sprung up increasingly after the introduction of the tramway. Especially in the northeast, walking through the streets might make you feel like you're somewhere in Austria. After the 1890s, the neo-Renaissance style was largely replaced by Art Nouveau style buildings, the most notable example of which is the impressive main railway station designed by Władysław Sadłowski. The main entrance was topped with a proud steel dome and decorated with mythological sculptures. The symmetrical pavilions, which extend into both sides of the stations, are each topped with a small cupola. It was one of the most beautiful train stations in all of Europe, and would later even inspire the new railway stations in Prague and Vienna. The Lemberg main station, alongside many other great building projects that were finalized in the city in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, were constructed by an architectural bureau headed by Ivan Levinsky, a Ukrainian architect, businessman, and professor at the Polytechnic School. Many of the talented young architects in Lemberg acquired practical experience in Lewinsky's firm, and soon it became the most influential center of architectural development in the city. Lewinsky's influence becomes apparent very quickly when you walk through the city, as he helped construct the railway station, the Civic Theatre, Hotel George, the Chamber of Commerce and Industry, alongside dozens of apartment houses. In short, it's fair to say that within just a few decades, Lemberg saw a massive amount of growth and architectural development that even overshadowed the urban redesign conducted by the Austrian authorities in the previous century. The new Lemberg reflected the upper class's growing confidence and their pride in the city's transformation into a European metropolis. Already in 1858, Lemberg had received gas-powered streetlights. In 1894, the city set up an electrical tram network with wagons built by the renowned German company Siemens & Halske. Economically speaking, the city saw very little growth in terms of industrialization, and most of its wealth came from trade and commerce, just like in the previous centuries. But it did see a massive growth in population. In just a couple of decades, Galicia's capital grew from 87,000 inhabitants in 1869 to more than 212,000 in 1914. Most of these new inhabitants came from other parts of Galicia, which was a predominantly rural crownland with poor infrastructure, widespread poverty, and with very few opportunities for societal advancement. By 1910, Lemberg had been transformed into a confident and bustling city that had, at least on the outside, a firmly Polish face with Polish street names, Polish monuments, a Polish-dominated education system, and Polish cultural institutions. According to the Austrian census of 1910, 86% of all Lembergers stated that Polish was their colloquial language. That number needs to be taken with a pinch of salt, however, as the censuses didn't ask for the native language, but for the colloquial language. What exactly that meant was up to interpretation, and seeing as everybody could only pick one language, most people just picked the one that was most dominant. The census also didn't take people into account who spoke two or more languages. And there were a lot of people like this in the city, because Lemberg still remained very multi-ethnic despite the Polonisation effort. As such, the census on religious affiliation provides a much clearer picture. 51% of respondents stated that they were Roman Catholics, and it's fair to say that most of them were Poles. 19% stated that they belonged to the Greek Catholic Church, which was most associated with Galicia's Ruthenian population. And finally, 28% stated that they were of Israelite or Jewish faith. We've been talking about the Poles in the city for quite a long time now, so it's finally time to take a look at the other two groups, starting with the Ruthenians. In the late 19th century, the question of what a Ruthenian even was far from clear, and in the decades following the 1848 revolution, countless intellectuals tried to answer that very question. The first answer was provided after the 1850s by the so-called Old Ruthenians, a movement that was mostly supported by the Greek Catholic clergy. The Old Ruthenians were centered around the Greek Catholic Cathedral in Lemberg and were united by their search for a distinct Ruthenian identity and their desire to distance themselves from the Poles, and the assertion that Ruthenians merely spoke a Polish dialect. The Old Ruthenians felt a vague sense of cultural unity with the Slavs in neighboring Russia, but still felt loyal to the Habsburg Empire, in both a political and religious sense. But they never found a clear answer to explain what ethnicity they were actually a part of. Were the Ruthenians in Galicia part of a unique ethnicity? Were they part of one Ukrainian nation? Or were they even part of one united Rus people alongside Russians, Ukrainians and Belarusians? Various Old Ruthenians gave different answers to those questions at varying times. As time went on, certain individuals who were not satisfied with this constant indecisiveness joined the populist Ukrainophiles instead. They were the first ones to call themselves Ukrainians and declared that the Ruthenians in Austria and the Ukrainians in the Russian Empire were part of the same people. The movement gained particular traction in Lemberg in the 1880s and included notable figures such as the brothers Volodymyr and Alexander Barvinsky, the former being a writer and the latter being a politician, the parliamentarian Julian Romanchuk, and the musician Anatol Vakhyanin. Most Ukrainophiles were teachers or intellectuals, and they can be considered the first members of the Ukrainian intelligentsia in the city. They concentrated most of their efforts in the field of education and founded the Prosvita in 1868. The name translates to Enlightenment in English, and it was a cultural organization which founded reading halls in Galician villages, published books in written Ukrainian, and wrote school books for Ukrainian children. In 1880, the Ukrainophiles even published their own newspaper, the Dilo. Arguably the most famous Ukrainophile was the writer Ivan Franko. For a long time, Franco had been a socialist and believed that a federative empire could be the solution for the growing nationalistic conflicts. That changed after a young Polish student attempted to shoot him shortly after Franco had published an article criticizing the hypocrisy of the Polish elite, who were quick to decry the discrimination of the Poles, but saw no problem in discriminating against the Ruthenian minority in Lemberg. From that point on, he only wrote in Ukrainian and advocated for an independent all-Ukrainian state. This meant, however, that Franco now had a much smaller audience than before and thus had to publish pretty much non-stop. In 1908, he collapsed due to exhaustion and an untreated rheumatism. He died just 6 years later. He was, without a doubt, one of the most important Ukrainian writers, and today the University of Lviv and even a city are named after him. The Ukrainophile movement was surprisingly successful. In 1893, vernacular Ukrainian was accepted by the Austrian Ministry of Education as the official language of Eastern Galicia's Slavic population, and 1 year later, the University of Lemberg received a department for Ukrainian history. Not everyone was happy with this new development, and so a new Russophile counter-movement began to emerge in the 1890s, which claimed that there was only one greater Russian people with one common language: Russian. In the Galician parliament, Russophiles such as Dmitro Markov or Volodymyr Dudykevich criticized the Austrian government for sympathizing with the Ukrainians and for their plans to separate the Ruthenians from the Russians. Up until the First World War, there was no such thing as a united Ruthenian national movement, and Lemberg was the spiritual center for Old Ruthenians, Ukrainophiles, and Russophiles alike. The only thing that united all of them was that they were opposed to the Polonisation of Lemberg and the dominant role the Poles played in the city. As such, conflicts between the two groups became almost inevitable. A frequent bone of contention was the university, where the idea of introducing Ukrainian professorships or even the notion of founding a Ukrainian university led to many protests and even brawls. In one of these fights, the Ukrainian student Adam Kotsko was killed. In 1908, a Ukrainian student went so far as to kill the governor of Galicia, Andrzej Potocki. The nationality conflict also had a socio-economic component, however, as Lemberg's proletariat, mostly consisting of Ukrainian day laborers, artisans and workers, frequently demonstrated against exploitative work conditions. Between 1900 and 1904 alone, more than 140 strikes were recorded. In 1902, one of those strikes even led to the death of 15 workers after a cavalry regiment violently cracked down on the demonstrators. Now let's also take a quick look at Lemberg's Jewish population. The year 1867 was an important year for the city's Jews in two different ways. For one, the new constitution finally made them equal citizens without any sort of restrictions, and they were finally allowed to escape the crowded living conditions in the ghetto. Now a process of acculturation into Polish culture could be observed, as many Jews hope to rise up the social ladder that way and to escape anti-Jewish prejudices. The Reformed synagogue in Lemberg changed its name from German Israelite House of Prayer to a simple but effective progressive synagogue, and shortly after, the sermon was given in Polish. Another factor that contributed to this Polonisation was the ascent of the socialist movement. Polish socialists, such as Hermann Diamant, demanded full equality for Jewish people and their integration into Polish society, while simultaneously condemning the Jewish identity as outdated and superstitious. The Polish education system also helped to accelerate this process. Between 1871 and 1902, the number of Jews at public schools in Lemberg rose from 1,261 to 5,668, and by the turn of the 20th century, only a small minority of Jews didn't attend those schools. Many Jewish students didn't stop there, however, but instead sought to get further educated by enrolling at the university. By 1910, Jews made up more than a quarter of Lemberg's university students, and many of them would become either lawyers or doctors. This new Jewish intelligentsia became increasingly visible in the city as they moved further away from the former ghetto into the traditionally Christian quarters and set up their offices there. In the 1880s, the assimilationists began to spread their ideals in the Jewish community. They began to publish a magazine called Ojczyzna, which translates to the fatherland, in which they encouraged their readers to practice their faith in the Polish language. Notable authors were the poet Wilhelm Feldman, the parliamentarian Philipp Zucker, or the banker Adolf Lilien. Unfortunately for them, their efforts were only partially successful. While it is true that knowledge of the Polish language increased significantly among Lemberg's Jews in the late 19th century, the largely Orthodox Jews in the city were reluctant to give up their old ways. Furthermore, the effort of acculturation was only met with minor approval from the side of the Poles, and the predominant Polish intelligentsia was very reluctant to accept new Jewish members. After the 1890s, the Ojczyzna magazine had to be shut down. In the very last issue, the assimilationists wrote, "Being tired and exhausted, we resign. We thought and still think that Jews can only be made citizens with the cooperation of native Polish society. It seemed to us that Polish society would give us a helping hand in this common work for mutual benefit. We were disappointed. What has the Crownland of Galicia done during its 25 years of autonomy to facilitate the moral and economic elevation of the Jewish people?" The writer and poet Wilhelm Feldman was also disappointed, but unwilling to accept defeat or to give up his mission. Ojczyzna has been published for 12 years now and has its place in the social history of Galicia. A future scholar will not remain unmoved looking at the image of a handful of young people emerging around 1880 from the mass of half Germanized and half Asiatic Jewry, with a white eagle on a banner held in their mighty hands. As the ideals of assimilation and acculturation into Polish society became less and less popular, more and more Jews began to look for alternative solutions for self-transformation. And one of those solutions was Zionism. Eastern Galicia, and Lemberg especially, were one of the first centers of the Zionist movement in Austria-Hungary, a movement which glorified Jewish culture and considered Jews to be their own ethnicity deserving of their own independent state. Zionism was particularly popular among students from the university and the high schools who worried about the growth of modern anti-Semitism and the increasing hostility of the Polish majority. Even Alfred Nossig, the first editor of Ojczyzna, would later become an ardent supporter of Zionism. In the eyes of Wilhelm Feldman, Zionism was just a fanatical fairy tale solution to the Jewish question, and the new Jewish state was nothing more than a reconstruction of the ghetto, which would undo all of the progress he and his colleagues had achieved. But still, the Zionist movement did prevail over the assimilationists, and in the same year that Ojczyzna was shut down, the Zionists began to publish their own journal called Przyszłość, which translates to future. By the start of the First World War, the assimilationist movement had been reduced to irrelevance. Over the course of the late 19th century, Lemberg had become an important center for the Polish, Ukrainian and Jewish national movements, and, not surprisingly, animosities between them had been growing. The Ukrainians demanded the same rights as the Poles, a Ukrainian university, more Ukrainian schools, and a stop of the Polonisation policies, demands which the Polish-dominated city council absolutely did not want to fulfill. Furthermore, the so-called National Democratic Movement headed by Roman Dmowski, which propagated radical Polish nationalistic, social Darwinist and anti-Semitic worldviews, began to establish itself in the city. Anti-Semitism was also on the rise in Galicia, with the Catholic priest Stanisław Stajowski roaming the countryside and spreading anti-Semitic propaganda by telling farmers that the Jews alone were the reason for their misery and that they would have to be removed from all economic positions of power. As such, boycotts against Jewish shops and acts of violence against Jewish citizens became semi-frequent. Still, it would be wrong to assert that daily life in multi-ethnic Lemberg was dominated by nationalistic feuds. Most inhabitants felt a strong sense of pride about living in this city and defined themselves first and foremost as Lembergers, not as Poles, Ruthenians or Jews. All things considered, the various groups got along decently well on a daily basis and even intermingled among each other. For example, before the Great War, every sixth marriage had been between a Pole and a Ruthenian. But still, Poles, Ukrainians and Jews liked to keep to themselves for the most part, which can be clearly seen in the example of the Lemberg cafes. In the late 19th century, cafes became an important social meeting spot all across the Habsburg Empire, where people came to enjoy a coffee, read newspapers, write, hold discussions, or to play games. They were a peaceful space where one could relax and socialize, and Lemberg was no exception. The Café Schneider, south of the old town, was particularly popular among Polish artists, journalists and officers, but also among the members of local organizations such as the Bicycle Association or the Society for Photography. During his days as a socialist, the writer Iwan Franko would also frequently visit the cafe to meet up with his friend and fellow writer Jan Kasprowicz. As Franko adopted a much more nationalistic worldview, he abandoned the Café Schneider and instead frequented the Café Monopol. Shortly after, other Ukrainian writers and university students came to the cafe in order to talk to Franko or to ask for his advice. The Monopol was also popular among Ukrainian artists and intellectuals, and even some prominent members of the Shevchenko Scientific Society liked to come here. Just a few hundred meters away, the Café Abacja offered a comfortable meeting spot for the Jewish intelligentsia. The Café Abacja contributed a lot to the politicization of Lemberg's Jews, as many journalists came here to write their articles for Yiddish newspapers. A prominent guest was Gershom Bada, a Zionist activist and writer who also became a sort of mentor for other aspiring Jewish writers. In the years preceding the Great War, it seemed like a lot of the national grievances could be resolved as pragmatic and far-sighted politicians rose to the scene who denounced the discriminatory policies of the Polish elite. One of them was the socialist Ludwik Kulczycki, who wrote, "Our nationalistic stubbornness, our exclusivity mean that our culture is less attractive than it once was, and that our assimilatory powers are diminishing." The new governor, Michał Bobrzyński, who took the position in 1908, set about to reach a compromise between Lemberg's Poles and Ruthenians. With that, he followed a trend of an increase in the willingness to compromise that could be observed in Austria-Hungary at that time. Famous examples of this include Moravia and the Bukovina. Furthermore, the increased democratization of the empire with the introduction of the equal, free and secret right to vote in the elections for the Imperial Council, as well as the expansion of the rule of law, made it so that national conflicts were increasingly fought out in a civilized manner and on a legal basis, in courts for example, or in the newspapers. In February 1914, the Galizien Regional Council reformed the election system so that it was more favorable to the Ruthenian population. In Lemberg, the city council promised that it would no longer be blocking the founding of a Ukrainian university and that it would allow the construction of additional Ukrainian schools. These reforms were long overdue and could probably have made it possible for all the ethnic groups to live together peacefully in the future, had it not been for the First World War. The war ruined any of the efforts of reconciliation and massively intensified national conflicts. At first, the Austrian authorities blamed the military defeats on the Eastern Front on the Russophilic Ruthenians in Galicia and accused them of treason. Several thousand Ruthenians, regardless of whether or not they were actual Russophiles, were executed, and tens of thousands were sent to the Thalerhof camp near Graz, where they lived under inhumane conditions. The Austrian military mostly relied on accusations given to them by Polish politicians and civil servants, who saw this wave of repression as a great tool to finally destroy the pesky Ukrainian national movement. The governor of Galicia, Witold Korytowski, for example, reported to Vienna that Ruthenians were largely pro-Russian and that the Ukrainian national movement was largely insignificant. The loyalty of the traditionally pro-Habsburg Ruthenians was put to the test. Instead of listening to the Ruthenians, the Austrians had relied on statements given to them by Polish politicians. Still, the growing animosity wasn't necessarily directed towards the Habsburgs or the army, but towards the Poles and the Jews, who were instead blamed for the injustice. For a brief period of time between the autumn of 1914 and the summer of 1915, Lemberg fell under Russian military occupation. The new Russian administrators pursued a policy of strict Russification and persecuted local politicians who they accused of being pro-Austrian, spies or traitors. Many of them would end up being executed or deported to Siberia. The population of the city suffered from severe supply shortages, hunger and insufficient healthcare. During this period of hardship, the tensions between the ethnic groups grew even further as everybody struggled for survival and accused the others for their misfortune. Things would only get worse after the Central Powers retook the city in June 1915. The Austrian military dictatorship relentlessly searched for people who collaborated with the Russians, and many people in the city began to report their neighbors. Hundreds of actual or supposed collaborators were arrested, among them Ukrainian university professors and even Poles. For the Polish elite, which had dominated the city for almost half a century now, this was a new experience, and it made them question their loyalty to the Habsburg Empire. The Austrians brought with them a way of rule dominated by paranoia and arbitrariness. They accused members of all of the city's ethnic groups of treason or obstruction and conducted countless summary proceedings which led to executions and expropriations. However, it was usually one particular ethnic group that was targeted more than the others at any given time, be it Poles, Ukrainians or Jews. Quickly, the affected ethnic groups began to mostly blame the others for their misery, a development which the Austrian military fostered by encouraging the denouncement of alleged traitors. As the war took its toll, the ethnic tensions worsened. Life was much more miserable than in other European cities, and the lack of food as well as the spreading of disease such as tuberculosis and typhus greatly increased the mortality rate. The suspicion that another ethnic group might be living at your expense only further increased animosity. The anti-Semitic stereotype of the greedy Jew who profited off the suffering of others also found new popularity. The First World War and the repressive Austrian military dictatorship had a devastating effect on the coexistence between Lemberg's ethnic groups. Before the war, the constitution, the rule of law, the mostly free press and the stability that the Austro-Hungarian Empire could provide ensured that problems could be articulated peacefully, and more often than not, compromises could be reached. All these possibilities for a peaceful solution of any given national conflict were washed down the drain when a new repressive and arbitrary state apparatus was introduced in Galicia, where newspapers were censored and potential traitors were either executed or imprisoned. Now the ethnic tensions could only be resolved with violence, and by the end of the war the Poles and the Ukrainians were at each other's throats. Both the Central Powers and the Allies promised the creation of both a Polish and a Ukrainian nation-state. In his famous 14 points, the American president Woodrow Wilson stated in January 1918 that each ethnicity had the right for self-determination in post-war Europe, and that a new Polish state should be created which encompassed all territories inhabited by Poles. Lemberg was definitely a majority Polish town, but it was surrounded by mostly Ukrainian-speaking territories. Who should the city belong to then? Things got even worse when the Central Powers recognized the Ukrainian People's Republic and promised it the province of Chełm in exchange for food deliveries, a province which the Poles also desired for their future Polish state. Tens of thousands of Poles demonstrated against the so-called bread peace in Lemberg, and later even a general strike was proclaimed. When it became clear that the Central Powers were undoubtedly going to lose this war and that the borders of Central Europe would be redrawn, Lemberg became the center of the conflict between Polish and Ukrainian national ambitions, who both considered the city to be theirs. On the 1st of November 1918, Austrian rule over the city, which had lasted for almost 150 years, came to an end when members of the Ukrainian military took control over the city and proclaimed the West Ukrainian People's Republic. But that wouldn't be the end of it. Far from it. What followed was a period of war between Poles and Ukrainians, a conflict that would see unimaginable acts of horrific violence and would leave permanent scars, which would negatively affect the coexistence of the city's ethnic groups during the interwar period. But how the people of Lwów fared during the times of the Second Polish Republic and how the city developed is something that we're going to take a look at in the next video. Alright then, vielen lieben Dank for watching the video until the end. I hope you've enjoyed part 2 of this series about the history of Lviv and that I will see you again in the next one. In any case, a like and a subscribe would of course be greatly appreciated. A very special thank you goes out to my generous supporters on Ko-Fi, however, who keep this channel afloat pretty much. A Cup of Tea, Tristan Kriegsmann, Ryan Layton, Philipp Marchewka, Marius Gerling, the Grand Duke of Sealand, Luca Drohle, Wienweh, Süderreise, Dial Furphy, Yin, William, and Big Dave. You are just phenomenal. Have a very wonderful day and see you next time.